The year was 1813, and the Napoleonic Wars raged across Europe. Napoleon Bonaparte had just suffered multiple defeats after trying to invade Moscow, the capital of the Russian Empire, in 1812, and Leipzig, Germany, in October of 1813. After these defeats, Denmark and Norway, which was on Napoleon's side after Great Britain attacked Copenhagen in 1807, was forced to cede the territory of Norway to Sweden, which was under the control of Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, more well known as Karl Johan, who was one of Napoleon's generals, but in 1810 he flipped and sided with Russia and Great Britain. On January 14th, 1814, the Danish king, Frederick VI, ceded Norway to Sweden with the signing of the Treaty of Kiel. Norway had gone from being in possession of the Danish king to being under Karl Johan. But really, in Norway, a power vacuum had opened. Danish authorities no longer had power, and a Swedish presence had not yet been established. Taking advantage of the situation, Christian Frederick, cousin of the King of Denmark-Norway and vice-regent of Norway, met with 112 elected representatives in Norway in Eidsvoll on April 10th, 1814. 2 days later, on April 12th, a special committee was created to draft a new constitution that stated that Norway was a free, independent, and indivisible realm. Executive power was to lay with the king, legislative with popularly elected National Assembly, and judicial power with independent courts. There was the freedom of religion and the press. The special committee submitted its final proposal on May 2nd, and on May 17th, the Constitution of Norway was adopted, and the members of the National Assembly elected the Kingdom of Norway's first king, Christian Frederick, the first king of Norway in any capacity in almost 500 years. May 17th is still a national holiday in Norway to this day. However, Karl Johan refused to accept Norway's independence since, under the Treaty of Kiel, Denmark ceded Norway to Sweden, and thus, war. On July 29th, 1814, Swedish troops marched into Norway. On the same day, Swedish gunboats met Norwegian gunboats at Frøler. The Swedish won as Norwegian boats retreated to Tonsberg. The Swedish occupied the islands for the entire rest of the war. 2 days later, on August 4th, land troops met with the Swedish near the southern border in Tistedalen. Norwegian troops were pummeled by the 1,500 Swedish troops, and they were forced to retreat. Meanwhile, further to the north, in a field near Konsvinger called Lier, Norwegian troops under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Samuel Krebs won their first victory of the war, with a Swedish retreat south to Malmö and later to Matrand. Norwegian farmers around the area gave reliable information to Krebs that the Swedish troops were retreating to Matrand, and they decided to cut them off in the largest battle of the entire war. On August 5th, 1814, Swedish and Norwegian troops met at Matrand, and Norway won, routing the enemy troops across the Swedish border and out of the country. Andreas Krebs ended the war being the only commander to win any battles in the entire war. Back down in the southern theater, Swedish troops invaded and captured the Isegran fort in Fredrikstad on August 4th. And later, at Rakestad, 3,000 troops met on both sides in a total defeat for the Norwegians again, and a pursuit by the Swedish. It was clear to King Christian Frederick that after the taking of Isegran fort, the Swedish would win the war. But they still could avoid an unconditional surrender at the Battle of Longs, where Norwegian troops surprise attacked, and then Swedish troops pummeled the trenches of the Norwegians until they had run out of ammunition, and the Norwegians retreated in the night. The battle ended a tactical victory for the Norwegians, and they succeeded in avoiding an unconditional surrender. It was clear to Norwegian commanders that the war was over after Longness, and that the Swedish had won. 5 days later, Christian Frederick and Karl Johan negotiated a ceasefire, but not before one last battle. At a bridge in southern Norway near Moss, Swedish and Norwegian troops met for one final confrontation on August 14th, the day that the Convention of Moss was signed. Only 75 Swedish troops met with the 600 Norwegian men at Kjolberg Bridge, and despite all odds, the Swedish came out on top with only 3 casualties compared to the Norwegians' 30. The Norwegian troops retreated in a loss for the final battle of the war. There were 8 total battles in the entire war, and only 2 were definitely Norwegian victories under Andreas Samuel Krebs. Krebs was hailed as the hero from Lier and Matrand, and was considered to have saved Norway's pride in an otherwise horrible war. The Battle of Langnes was a tactical victory for the Norwegians, if not a real victory, and is still contested by both the Swedish and Norwegian as to whose victory it was. On the same day as the Battle of Kjolberg Bridge, in the city of Moss, in the Moss Ironworks main office, the Convention of Moss was negotiated and signed by Norwegian and Swedish officials. Christian Frederick was not part of the Convention of Moss. Instead, the convention was negotiated by two of his ministers, Niels Ahl and Jonas Collett. Christian Frederick was required to renounce the Norwegian throne and leave the country. Still, his actions during the war allowed the Treaty of Kiel to be subdued and allow for a more equal union between Sweden and Norway, with the Norwegian constitution that was signed in Eidsvoll to be recognized in the Union and still in use today, and Norway to still have its own parliament. This war was the final war that Sweden was ever a part of, and the last war between the nations of Sweden and Norway. Christian Frederick became King of Denmark in 1839 and stayed King of Denmark until his death in 1848. Norway remained in a personal union with Sweden until it gained a peaceful independence in 1905, and remained independent until 1940 when it was invaded by Nazi Germany. It regained its independence in 1945 and has remained a sovereign nation ever since.